Here are photos of people behind barbed wire. Gaunt faces, torn clothes, empty eyes. You'd think these were taken in Europe during World War II, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, but no, these pictures come from the other side of the world, from Africa, where the British Army built the first concentration camps in history, Europeans locking up other Europeans. And now imagine this, 100 years later, in those very same places, there would be not camps, but entire districts, the so-called Bantustans. They weren't built by the British this time, but by white descendants of the Boers who had once been imprisoned in those camps. That's where the black population would later be forcibly moved, under the pretense of self-governance and separate development. Same planes, same fences, same obsession with control, just under a different flag. How did a country that began with a fight for freedom turn into a symbol of racial inequality and repression? Why is South Africa always a story about power, fear, and survival? And what do the cursed diamonds and gold have to do with it? Setting: Sub-Saharan Africa. To the west lies a coastline they call the Skeleton Coast. Sounds creepy? Well, that's because it is. For hundreds of kilometers, the Namib Desert stretches right into the ocean. And from the sand, you can see the rusted bones of shipwrecks jutting out toward the waves. Cold Benguela currents push them ashore, and once they're stranded, there's no getting them back. Fog, fierce winds, scorching heat by day, freezing air by night. In a word, the place is tough. No wonder even the colonizers, usually eager to tame everything in sight, weren't in a hurry to claim it. But to the east, a completely different story. Along the Indian Ocean lies the Swahili coast, lively, colorful, buzzing with trade. City after city, Mombasa, Kilwa, Zanzibar. In the Middle Ages, these ports thrived on global commerce, stretching from Arabia to India. Caravans left here loaded with ivory, gold, and spices, and came back with textiles, weapons, and exotic goods. Exactly the kind of action that everyone wanted to get is on, first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British. Because whoever controlled these ports controlled trade across half the Indian Ocean. And right in the middle of it all, the land we're talking about today, South Africa. The Cape of Good Hope. That name isn't just poetic. It's the gateway between the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, a strategic choke point sailors from all over the world fought to control. Whoever held it held the trade routes. And on top of that, this wasn't some empty wasteland. The land here was rich, fertile valleys perfect for farming, and buried underneath them, all the stuff that would later flip the entire economy upside down. Gold, diamonds, platinum, coal, iron, copper, uranium. But people wouldn't realize those riches were a curse. Not yet. Back then, nobody cared about gold or diamonds. The goal was simple: survive by toiling the land. And that's where the real chaos began, because the chessboard suddenly had 4 players on it. First came the Khoisan, hunter-gatherers, short, tough, with one of the world's oldest languages, full of those famous clicking sounds. Then the Bantu tribes moved in from the north, farmers and herders bringing iron, new customs, and slowly pushing the Khoisan out into the deserts. And in the 17th century, the Dutch arrived. They settled near the Cape, built farms, raised families, and before long, they stopped seeing themselves as Dutch. They started seeing themselves as people of this land, Afrikaners. The same people whose descendants would later build the Boer republics and go head-to-head with the British Empire. Ironically, the word Boer in Dutch means a redneck, a clumsy brute from the farm. Well, soon the British will see what those country boys can do. The British showed up here in the early 19th century, almost by accident, really. As usual, they were just passing through on their way to India. What they needed was a port, a place to refuel and fix their ships on the long journey between Europe and Asia. In 1806, they took full control of the Cape Colony, the same one that used to belong to the Dutch, and that was it. New flag, new laws, new language. The Afrikaners, descendants of those Dutch farmers, didn't like it one bit. They had no interest in taking orders from London, so they packed up and moved north, farther and farther away from the Redcoats. That Great Migration would go down in history as the Great Trek. Those who left built their own states, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. In essence, these were independent farming republics held together by cattle, guns, and the Bible. The Boers, as the Afrikaners came to be called, lived by their own rules and didn't answer to anyone. But peace didn't last. By the end of the 19th century, the British were back. And this time, it wasn't by accident. They had a very good reason to push deep into the continent again. On Boer land, they found something worth fighting over: diamonds. It all starts in 1867, when a boy named Erasmus Jacobs picks up a shiny little stone by the river. At first, nobody thinks much of it. Just another pebble, right? But a couple of years later, it turns out to be a real diamond. And that's when the diamond rush begins. Mines spring up around Kimberley, drawing thousands of people from all over the world. The British quickly get involved. One of them, Cecil Rhodes, turns diamond mining into politics. He founds De Beers and basically buys out the entire industry. Along with it, control over Boer territory. To protect their interests, Britain goes to war. That's how South Africa's first Diamond War begins. A brutal clash over resources where both sides stop seeing each other as human. This would become South Africa's first diamond curse: wealth, underground breeding poverty, and death above it. When the British realized they couldn't win fast, they switched to a scorched earth strategy. They burned farms, slaughtered livestock, destroyed supplies, anything to starve the Boers into surrender. Women and children were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, the first of the 20th century, officially called just that. And in those camps, filth, typhoid, starvation. The famous photo, a girl named Lizzie Van Zyl, starved to skin and bone, who died in the Bloemfontein camp. After her death, activist Emily Hobhouse sent reports to London exposing the true scale of the catastrophe. Thousands of women and children dying not from bullets, but from the British system itself. That's how the war for diamonds turned into South Africa's first experiment in mass internment. And the camps weren't the only new invention tested in this war. The fighting took place far from London or Amsterdam, but the technology, that was straight out of cutting-edge Europe. The British laid railways, sent out armored trains, stitched the plains with blockhouses and barbed wire, ran telegraph lines, flashed heliographs, and even floated observation balloons. In artillery, rapid-fire guns with explosive shells. In the infantry, magazine rifles using smokeless powder and Maxim machine guns. But the Boers weren't some hillbillies with rusty rifles. They had precise Mausers, long-range French long toms, great camouflage, and solid sniper skills. They hit railways smartly, cut communications, and vanished before the British could strike back. So the question is, how did yesterday's farmers get their hands on all this military tech? Simple answer: the Germans helped. They had their own colony right next door, German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia. And of course, they weren't about to miss a chance to trip the British up. They supplied the Boers with weapons and gear. That would come back around later. The Afrikaners would keep a soft spot for Germany for decades. When World War II broke out, South Africa was technically part of the British Commonwealth, but public opinion was split. Some thought fighting for London meant betraying their ancestors. Others said there was no real choice. In the end, the country did join the war on Britain's side, but without much enthusiasm. Inside, society was divided. A good part of the population openly sympathized with the Germans. And since we've mentioned German sympathizers, there's something else in South Africa's story that, to put it mildly, feels eerily familiar if you know your 20th century history. Ironically, the parallels with Nazi Germany begin long before Hitler, with the way people of the wrong skin color were treated. Even the early Boers, while settling the fertile lands, started turning the local population into slaves. Historically, slavery thrives where labor is cheap and the soil is rich. Sadly, South Africa had both: a mild climate, fertile land, and plenty of hands to work it. And once again, the country's old curse came into play: abundance of resources breeding human misery. Africans worked the farms, while imported Indian laborers were sent into the mines and onto the railroads. And when, by the late 19th century, Britain outlawed the slave trade, that hardly made the empire more popular around here. Now that you've got the bigger picture of how South Africa's story unfolded, what came next probably won't surprise you. Technically, the country hadn't been a colony for a while. Since 1931, it was a dominion with its own parliament, and by 1961, after leaving the British Commonwealth, it became a fully independent republic. But freedom didn't come for everyone. In 1948, the National Party won the elections, led by Daniel Malan, a deeply religious Calvinist, and also a firm believer in white supremacy. And now, he was running the country. That's how apartheid was born, a legal system dividing people by the color of their skin, written into their passports, schools, buses, even their love lives. The irony couldn't be sharper. The world had just defeated Nazism, and yet, right at that moment, South Africa was launching its own version of it. Picture this. You're a young Zulu man living on the outskirts of Johannesburg. Morning. The city's right there, close enough to see. But to get in, you need a special pass. Without it, you have no right to be in the white zone. At the bus stops, separate benches. At shop entrances, signs that read, "Whites only." Even the crosswalks are split. White pedestrians walk on one side of the street, black pedestrians on the other. Mix them up by accident, and you're arrested. On the bus, separate seats. In the parks, separate toilets and water fountains. Then you head home, if you're lucky, to a Bantustan like KwaZulu, or maybe Transkei, or Bophuthatswana. These territories were invented by the government to separate the tribes. You were classified as Zulu, or Xhosa, or Tswana, and sent to live where the authorities thought you belonged. Families were torn apart. A father could end up in KwaZulu, a mother in Transkei, the children somewhere else entirely. In schools for black children, the curriculum wasn't physics or math. Instead, they were taught to serve, how to work on farms, how to follow orders. White kids, on the other hand, were taught economics, law, geography, English, and Afrikaans, the languages of power. So how did they even decide what race or tribe you belonged to? Simple. By sight. Literally. The most infamous example was called the pencil test. Officials would stick a pencil into your hair. If it got stuck, too curly, you were classified as black or colored. If it fell out, congratulations, you were closer to white, and that damn pencil could determine your whole life, where you lived, who you could marry, where you could study, what kind of job you were allowed to have. The absurdity went so far that brothers from the same family could end up in different categories, one colored, the other black. And it wasn't just about Africans. South Africa had a full-blown racial hierarchy. At the top, whites. Then came the colored, a catch-all group for people of mixed descent, European, Malay, Malagasy, and African. Below them, Indians and other Asians. And at the very bottom, the native Africans. But even that latter had exceptions. For instance, the Japanese were labeled honorary whites because they brought money and technology into the country. Basically, if you had the right passport and a suitcase full of contracts, you could have been purple for all they cared. They'd still call you white. That's how flexible racism could get when profit was involved. And if you didn't have money or the right connections, well, tough luck. Apartheid didn't just ban marriages between whites and non-whites, it banned intimacy itself. The Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act made it illegal to marry across races, and the Immorality Act turned interracial relationships into a criminal offense, punishable by up to 7 years in prison. In Johannesburg in 1969, an Indian doctor named Zurina Desai and a white scientist, John Blacking, were dragged into court under charges of conspiring to commit immoral acts. Their relationship became front-page gossip for weeks. Both were found guilty, given suspended sentences, and chose to pack their bags and leave the country. And they got off easy. But this story exposes the deeper problem with apartheid. You might say, hold on, what deeper problem? Isn't the humiliation of human dignity enough? Sure, it is. But let's drop the emotions for a second and look at it coldly. The economics were insane. First, the system was expensive. You have a situation when everything comes in two stoplights, for whites and for blacks, 2 entrances, 2 bus stops, 2 school networks, constant duplication means, and constant waste. Second, it required a bloated police force just to chase people off the wrong sidewalk and check thousands of passes. Salaries, equipment, prisons, it all added up. And third, the country was sabotaging itself. A bright black kid was kept scrubbing floors instead of becoming a doctor or engineer. Productivity sank, innovation stalled, and the few who did manage to break through eventually hit the wall of those same cruel laws, and left, just like Zarina Desai and John Blacking. A brain drain, plain and simple. Bad for science, bad for business, bad for the budget. Any other country soon would have collapsed under these circumstances. So, why did South Africa survive? You got it, the resource curse. Though at first, it didn't look like a curse at all, more like a blessing. South Africa's soil held nearly the entire periodic table. Sure, it didn't have as many diamonds as neighboring Botswana, but about 10% of De Beers' production still came from South African mines. And when it came to platinum and chrome, the country was an absolute heavyweight. Nearly 90% of the world's platinum group metals and around 70% of global chrome reserves lay under South African ground. As for coal, there was so much of it that the country could both power itself and ship trainloads abroad. With numbers like that, the lack of oil or gas didn't seem like a big deal. The economy looked unsinkable. Even international sanctions couldn't shake it. And yes, there were sanctions. You can't just keep ignoring a regime that sorts people by skin color. At first, they were mostly symbolic: boycotts, cultural isolation, and arms embargo. Then the real hits started. By the mid-1980s, the US, Britain, Europe, and Japan imposed financial and trade restrictions. Loans were cut off, shipments stopped, investments frozen. Step by step, the world began isolating South Africa. And then, on top of sanctions, came the war. Let's shift west across Africa, Namibia. For years, it was a German colony, and after World War II, effectively under South African control. In the 1970s, a full-on independence movement kicks off. But Pretoria has no plans to let the territory go. Under the label of police operations, the army pushes deeper and deeper. Refugees flee across the border into Angola, where rebel camps soon spring up. The Soviet Union and Cuba start supplying weapons and training. In those military tents, you increasingly see instructors who are clearly not African. And at some point, all hell breaks loose. South African forces push north toward Angola's capital, but stall on the approaches. The rebels fight guerrilla style: ambushes, mines, quick raids. In response, South Africa comes up with its own fixes, developing armored vehicles built to survive mines and roadside blasts. Meanwhile, on the other side of the continent, Mozambique is on fire. Civil war, streams of refugees, terror attacks, and the biggest battle in Africa since World War II. That was South Africa's reality in the 1970s, a country pulled into wars and ringed by chaos. And do you know what else it was busy with at the same time, besides fighting? Its own nuclear program, that's what. South Africa had plenty of uranium mined alongside gold in the Witwatersrand Basin. The deposits were so massive that by the 1950s, the country had become one of the world's leading uranium suppliers. By the 1970s, research reactors were already running, and in the 1980s, the country built its first civilian nuclear power plant, Coburg, near Cape Town. The materials were local, the technology homegrown. 2 powerful reactors, each close to 1,000 megawatts, and to this day, it remains the only nuclear power station on the entire continent. Meanwhile, in deep secrecy, the military side of the program was moving forward too. By the late 1980s, South Africa had assembled 6 nuclear warheads, built entirely on its own, without help from any major power. But then everything changed. In the 1990s, the government decided to shut the program down, disarm, and report openly to the IAEA. And just like that, the first African country to build an atomic bomb became the first to give it up voluntarily. All thanks to this man, Nelson Mandela, the man who put an end to apartheid in South Africa. His legendary courtroom speech lasted 3 hours and ended with the words, "I am prepared to die."
It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
But he didn't die for the cause. Instead, he was sent to prison, where he spent 27 years. And there are still people today who think that sentence was justified. Mandela was at first a student of Mahatma Gandhi, who built an entire philosophy of peaceful protest in India. Mandela tried to follow the same path, Black South Africans openly broke the pass laws, crossed Bantustan borders without permits, sat in whites-only train cars, and went calmly to jail. But it didn't work. And to be fair, it hadn't really worked in India either. Gandhi fought for independence for more than 20 years and only succeeded after the war, when the British Empire was already falling apart. Mandela, meanwhile, was watching his people die now. After the Sharpeville massacre, when police opened fire on unarmed protesters, his patience ran out. Peaceful protest wasn't working, he realized. Freedom only stems from violence. That's when an organization called Umkhonto we Sizwe, the Spear of the Nation, was born. And with it, the era of bombings began. Let's just lay out the facts. May 1983, a car bomb goes off on Church Street in Pretoria, right outside Air Force headquarters. 19 dead, hundreds injured, smoke and shattered glass across the whole block. 2 years later, a bombing at the Amanzimtoti shopping mall. 5 people killed, dozens wounded, including children out shopping for Christmas presents. In 1986, another explosion, this time at Magoo's Bar in Durban, packed with civilians. 3 killed, around 60 injured. At the same time, landmines on rural roads, trucks and farm vehicles blown up. Yes, Mandela was already behind bars, and no direct proof tied him to these attacks. But it was the fighters of the organization he had founded and inspired who carried them out. So, should a man linked to all this have been imprisoned? Your call. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Either way, the politics of violence worked. By the early 1990s, President Frederick de Klerk realized the country could no longer hold together. The war in Namibia, constant sabotage, UN sanctions, global boycotts of South African goods, the flight of money and skilled professionals, all of it was slowly choking the economy. Even white families were fed up, leaving the country by the thousands, taking their money and expertise with them. So, de Klerk made a choice: better reforms than collapse. He freed Mandela, opened elections to black citizens, and sat down at the negotiating table. But here's the question: how did the regime survive that long? What kept the machine running through all those years of war and sanctions? You already know the answer: gold, platinum, coal, and uranium. By the way, about the uranium, seemed like it wasn't needed anymore. At the end of 1989, de Klerk winds down the military nuclear program. In early 1990, he orders the warheads dismantled, but he only goes public with the whole story in 1993. His explanation sounds perfect. The Cold War is over. Regional wars are dying down. The country needs to drop its pariah status, and giving up the bomb is the right move. Pretty speech, but a lot of people think the real motive was different. You don't leave a nuclear trigger in the hands of yesterday's victims of apartheid who might come to power tomorrow. After a century of repression, the desire for revenge is hardly imaginary, and nuclear civil war was one scenario de Klerk was not willing to risk. And a year later, in 1994, Mandela becomes South Africa's first black president. He doesn't have the bombs anymore, but he has power, and the option to retaliate. And here, he makes the defining choice of his life: to stop the wheel of violence. He understands that if yesterday's victims of apartheid start avenging themselves on whites, whites will retaliate, and it will become a perpetual war. You have to close the loop. So, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are established. Those commissions, on one hand, handled victims' claims, reparations, justice, the right to be heard. But more important, they listened to the former executioners too: policemen, soldiers, officials, the people who built and guarded the apartheid system. And many of those perpetrators were granted amnesty. The condition was public repentance. The commissions reviewed about 25,000 cases and issued hundreds of amnesties. Looks unfair. Villains walk free. But Mandela argued the country didn't need victor's justice. It needed unity, not revenge, but reconciliation. So, did it work? Well, let's just look at the numbers. Unemployment today is around 30%. Not good. The HIV situation is even worse. Nearly 6% of the population lives with the virus. In 2024, the country celebrated 100 straight days without rolling blackouts, and that was seen as a major achievement. That's one side of the story. On the other hand, inflation is under control, social programs are growing, especially in healthcare and anti-HIV efforts, and the economy, while struggling, is still afloat. Exports are alive and well, and not just of raw materials. In fact, cars make up about 15% of it. Did you know that almost every Volkswagen Polo cruising the smooth highways of Europe was assembled right here in South Africa? But the country's main lifeline hasn't changed. The land itself. Still the same gold, platinum, uranium, and diamonds. The very same riches whose curse has haunted South Africa for 5 centuries. If you liked Outwork, your like and a subscribe would be the best way to thanks Out Team. And if you want to see how a poor country with no gold or diamonds built a trading empire and then threw it all away, check out our video on the Netherlands.